Welcome back, everyone. Again, my name is Yasin Mukadam, and I'm from the PowerCat team. So I'll be talking about the Common Data Services Security Model, right? So with that, what I have is again, I'll go through the security concepts, high level. I'll talk about ownerships of records. We'll talk about teams, security roles, sharing, hierarchy, field level security, and then I have the security use case. And the outcome is going to be that you're going to understand the security concepts. So one of the ways to think of it is that if I am with my customer and I'm envisioning an application, then instead of using SharePoint list, I may want to consider using CDS as an option because it comes with all these native capabilities if it's for the right use case. And the second thing is that if you're already using CDS for a single application, I will walk you through some of the use cases, and then finally I will share how one of our largest customers is implementing the CDS security for a multi-tenant application. So you'll get that view as well. So if you have to host multiple apps that are accessing the same CDS instance, then how will you go about designing your security? So I'll just walk you through some use cases and close it out with that. Okay. All right. So with that, I'll get started. So again, uh, from the whole CDS, what is in the box, what we are covering from a security perspective is authorization. Uh, right? Authentication, like I mentioned previously, it's out of the box, it's shared, it's nothing special for CDS. Auditing is for compliance reasons. So for any entity, you can go and enable auditing, and we can share the link of how to enable it if you want to know. And then it just logs the CRUD operations for that entity. All right, so with that, we'll move on to the security features. So what do you get out of the box? You get very granular and very robust data. When I say security features, what I mean is data authorization capabilities that you would spend significant amount of time if you're using SQL or SharePoint or some other data source to achieve, you get it out of the box. So you can explicitly share individual records with people within that have access to the CDS instance, right? You can have ownership of records. So each user can be an owner of a record, or a team can be an owner of a record. So you get that out of the box as well. Then you have business units. Think of this as a firewall or a record partition or segmentation of your data within an entity. If you want to segment it for specific user groups or people, you can do that out of the box. It has parent-child hierarchy native available, so you can set that up easily. And then if you have any master data like countries, states, etc., that you don't want to apply any security, you can create it as organizational access and everybody could access it, right? So you have pretty granular individual group access that you can set up, and it's all available out of the box. So, and we have lots of features in security, so it can get a little confusing of when to use what, but I'll try my best to explain it as I walk through each of the capabilities. So how do we go about building all these advanced security features within the CDS product, right? So what we have is, we have the first is we have privileges. So you can think of privileges as, in simple terms, it is basically used to identify whether entity, I'll just go with an entity or an artifact, can be has create, read, update, share, append. So it has permission sets. Think of it as permission sets that you would go and define at various levels. And you will, or whenever you create a security role, it would be tied to a security role, and it is always cumulative. So if a user has access to two security roles, then they would get merged, and which with the highest permission would get applied, right? So that's privileges. That's what you need. You would do it for any security system. Then you have security roles, which is pretty much a container that you define, and you would create privileges within a security role for your entities, and then you would assign the security roles to a user or a team. And if you want the security role to show up in a business unit or at organization, you can have that definition as well. So you would do that. Then you have business units. Again, think of it as a scoping mechanism to grouping your data out of the box without writing any code or doing anything complex, right? And it's hierarchy in nature, so it's parent child, right? And we'll talk about it in more details. Then organization is pretty much, think of it as master data. If you want something to be available to everyone, you just give them organization permission, or more over it, you can just create an entity of type organization and it would be access to everyone and it won't apply any authorization. So you have that option as well. Sharing rules is, again, this is a very unique feature. It may be used, it may not be used, but it's there. So you can use it to share records explicitly with users or with teams on a case by case basis. If you provide the end users access, they can do that uh, uh, at the time of a business process or on demand when they want to engage other people. So you have that option. You have field level security, which is quite interesting. So if you have fields and you want to hide the data without doing any customization and pro dev work, you can enable field level profiles and say which users can see this data and which users cannot see this data. So you can do all that. So it'll get like hidden. It won't show them. It'll just show them as dots, right? And then you have hierarchy. This is like an add-on capability to the existing security model where you can have like your organization structure, your manager hierarchy can all view the records, or you have a position level hierarchy if you're in a metrics driven organization. So you could define those hierarchies as well for add-on security capabilities. So, so business unit is, again, it's the foundational to a serious security model structure, right? But usually people confuse a business unit structure with an organization structure. It should really not replicate your organization structure. It may in certain cases, but ideally you should avoid it, right? And you should design it more from a application security boundary or data segmentation standpoint. Like, for example, every CDS organization will always have a root business unit. But after that, if you want to have an entity like compliance and you want to segment the data, that only America's people in America's BUs, like the leadership team, should have access to the countries within America, and Europe should have access to the European data, then you would structure it that way. If you want to do it based on departments, you could do it based on departments. So it just depends on how your requirements are around data partition and data. Think of it as a data firewall. So your rules will of designing a business unit will be mostly around that, right? And like it's a logical separation, it controls access. So if a person is in if a user is in a business unit or in a team that is in a business unit, then they could only see those records unless they have the parent child permission. So it depends on how you set up the privileges. You can control access. And teams and users belong to one business unit. So that's very important to remember, that you cannot put a user in Americas and Europe. You have to put them in one. So when you're doing a multi-tenancy or you're trying to use CDS as a shared service, like some of our big customers are doing, at that time you have to have like a patterns and practices around security. So how end users will define the security so that when they deploy their application in a set shared environment, it functions properly, right? And again, your security roles could be scoped to a business unit. So that way they only show up in that business unit and others cannot see it. So that's at a high level what a business unit is, uh, right? And like I said, you could have sales, services, and you could define it based on your departments as well, right? And implications of a business unit is you would ideally want to design your business unit structure for users or teams that are not changing frequently. So if it's slow changing structure, then you do it. If the users are changing and moving a lot, it's not, then you may want to explore the option of teams because it's much easier to do it, right? Because it has ownership implications and so on and so forth. So, and then you may want to keep your volume of business units also controlled, right? And if you set up a user in a business unit, it is immediately available. So it's a data element. It's like an entity that you have to go and create the records, right? And if the data is growing linearly, then it's fine. It should not be like drastically growing. So that's when those are some of the implications and things to keep in mind when you're designing and thinking about business units. So next we'll talk about privileges. So again, privileges have a set of, you have privileges for create all your CRUD operations. And then we have something called append to. Assign is changing the ownership, and share is for sharing records. And append to is just used for related records. You need to have permission, one append and another append to. So it's just those privileges. And then you have access levels. So you could have global, which is organization. You can set that. That means everybody can read that record or create the record. You can go deep, which could be parent child business unit. So like if you're in my previous slide, I showed about organization Americas. So you could have America as the parent, and you could have Canada and USA as childs. So if you set parent child, then people in America can see records of people in US and Canada, right? So that's what it means. Local would be business unit specific. So only people in Canada business unit could see the Canada business unit, people or teams, right? Basic would be user level. So that means only the user who's owning the record can see the record or work with that record, or a team or members of a team can work on that record. So depending on what your requirements are, you may want to adjust the security privileges. And not no access means they cannot perform that operation. So that's a very granular and nicely structured privileges, and they are always defined within a security role. So if you go and create a new security role, you can define privileges. Then from a security role perspective, again, it's a container, really nothing fancy over here. You create a security role, you assign privileges, or the best practice is always to copy an existing security role and and do a save as, so you inherit existing permissions and then go and trim it, right? So, but this is how you would go about creating a security role. So you would go to settings and create security role. In the new admin experience, it would be somewhat similar. You could find it and create it. But this is like the old dynamic screenshot. And then from an organization perspective, again, like I said, you have two options. One, you could do it from a security privilege. You could give an entity an organization permission so that everybody can access it and perform the operation. Whatever privilege you give organization, everyone can modify that record or create the record and read the record. And same thing, if you're having a master data, then you may not want to worry about setting this permission sets. You can just give the organization the entity type as organization. That way it would not have any user level security ownership. The ownership would always be organization, and everyone could read it and access that record, right? So you have two options of organization access. Then from a sharing perspective, again, this, if people in the dynamics world would relate to this feature very well, right? Because you can share, if you give permissions to share, then an individual user at a given point in time can share the record with another team. So think of it as a transfer where you get a call, a service call, and it's routed to a team A. And when the team A is looking at that request or that case, it says, okay, this is not supposed to be me. It's a mistake, and they need to transfer it to another team. So at that time, sharing of the record becomes easy. So all they're doing is transferring the ownership and sharing the record. So they can work on it together, or they can completely do the ownership. So it just depends on what context you're looking at, right? So it's more at real time, near real time. The user is deciding who they want to share the record with. So again, it works well as intended. It's an exception mechanism, so it should not be used as like, we can enable sharing and then allow users to do the sharing. So there are performance issues with it because it goes and does checks for users, which is an add-on. It's stored in a separate entity, so it would go and do the check. So you need to be very careful around when and how you use this feature. If it's for exception cases, it makes sense. If it's going to be a common scenario, then you are better off using other mechanisms and rethinking your design, right? Just some food of thought there. So now we'll just touch base on field level security. So again, the gist of it is basically you have columns for an entity, and you want to say that I have a social security field. It's a sensitive field, and I don't want all the users to be seeing that data. So I want to basically get that record encrypted. So whenever they view it, it just shows as dots, right? As an example. So at that time, you would go and define field level security profile and assign the users or teams, and then only those people can see the record. If they don't have the permission, it will show them as dots, right, in the UI. So basically the data won't exist. So it's nice out of the box way to set up this, but don't do it for all the fields. Just be very cognizant about it, and do it only for mission critical fields or compliance fields or PIA fields. That's where this feature would be super useful. So you get this out of the box, and it's easy to set up. And so like you would define, it's not derived from security roles. You would create a security profile, put permissions to secure the fields, add users and teams. So it's just extra management or admin overhead to set it up. But it really serves an important purpose if your application has PIA data or some compliance information that you don't want to share with all the users. So you can easily set it up with no code solution and get it enabled. At least for model driven apps, it's super easy. For Canvas apps, it may not return the record at all if the user doesn't have permission. All right, so this is a add-on capability. So in addition to your business units, your security role, your sharing privileges, etc., right? If you want to have an add-on security where you want to do automatically roll up. So as an example, you want a department head to have access to all the records, or a manager to automatically see all their employee records, right? Then you may want to create you may want to look at an hierarchy security model. It again requires a separate setup, right? You could do it at a manager level. And then we have two options to do that. You'll have to pick which one to use. You cannot use both. So you have to pick which one to use, right? And again, people in Dynamics CE world may have used this, right? So that's what this is pretty much used for. And then if you have a manager hierarchy, it's pretty much your org structure. So if you have in your user entity, you have the manager field. If that is populated, then the CEO can see the records of salespeople, or the VP of sales can see the records of salespeople. So it will just follow the whole hierarchy, right? Which may already be defined. So if you are populating the user entity with the manager field, etc., it's all set up. So that's the good thing of this. And then if you say, I don't want to use the organization structure, I want to use a position driven structure where I'll go and define the position. So like, like a manager, but more than one person. So you can go and define your own position and work through that. So at that time, it would use that. So it's a choice that you have to make. And based on that, you could use one of the two hierarchy options. So now we'll talk about ownerships. So far we were just talking about the features, the components, what were there. Now we'll talk about what drives. So what are the mechanics that drives the actual authorization is through ownership. So a record can have three types of ownership. So it could be user owned, which means only that user, if the permission set is user, can see, view that record, right? And if the privileges is user, then that's what it is. The team is also a user level privilege, or if it's an organization. So you could have one of the three permissions, ownerships for a given a record. right? And a business unit is an add-on that sits on top of the user or teams if it is there. So it's like it works in conjunction with these three, and that's what derives the record authorization. Okay. If you look at ownership, its access is implicit. So it's basically a part of the entity. So every time you create a new entity in CDS, you will all, and if you select the entity type in user or teams, it would always come with an ownership field. And there would be an hidden business unit field. If you use the APIs, you can see it, but it would always come with these two fields. So which means that every time a record is created, it would always default to the user who has created the record, unless you write a rule or change the ownership to the team, right? So it's basically implicit. There's no need for secondary tables. You don't have like a secondary pointer table or anything like that, right? So it's super quick, it's super fast, and it scales seamlessly, right? So, but the drawback of it is limited to a single access per record. So it could be a user or it could be right, or team. But in this case, if it's a user, it would always be a single person who owns the record. And for a team, it's pretty much the same as users. The only difference is now you could have more than one person owning the record. So if you have a record that needs to be worked by more than one person, you may want to create a team, right? And if it has to be worked by a single person, you may put the ownership as a user. So to change the ownership to a team, you may have to do some kind of customization or ask the user to change it uh, uh, at the time of creating the record or after the record is created. And then we have two types of teams. Again, people from Dynamics world would know this. So you have owner teams, which has been around for many, many years. And then we added a new capability called access teams. So the difference between the two is pretty much one works through security roles, which is the owning team, and access team is pretty much uh, when you want to, in the simple differentiation to keep in mind is uh, if I know the members at the beginning when I'm creating the team in advance, then I may create an owner team. And if the members are not known in the beginning, right? I don't know in advance. At that time, I would create an access team, and then the user at that point of creating the record can basically assign members. So depending on the case, let's just take an example of a service case. Depending on the case, I may want to bring in people from various teams to work on this particular record of type case. Then I may create an access team, right? So again, access team, you would create it, you would have a separate mechanism to configure it using templates. So those are some of the differences, and it's pretty much the choices. Do I want to the members? Do I know it at design time when I'm building the application, or does it have to be at runtime when the record is created? So at that time, if the answer is when the record is created, then I would create an access team. If it is I know the members upfront, then it would be an owner team, right? So those are the two types of teams to keep in mind. Right. So when to use what, like I just stated it, it's pretty much records the user is required by a company's business policy. The number of teams is known at design time, and the daily reporting on progress by owning teams is required. So if you want to do some reporting uh, and it's known upfront, then you would do an owner team. An access team is something that is created by the CDS system at runtime for each record. So each record would have its own access team, and then you could add members for that record. So the scope of access team is limited to a record. The scope of an owner team could be scoped to the whole entity. So those are some additional differences to keep in mind. And then this is some guidelines of when to use what, right? Rapidly changing team members, the access to record scope by business areas. So again, it just boils down to that. Do I know my members upfront? If I don't know the members upfront of the team, then I may want to create an access team, right? And will the will the membership change for each record? If the answer is yes, then I would create an access team. So there are like some very uh, high level differences between the two options, right? And yeah, so it grows linearly versus, like I said, the access team is created out. The system created for each record. So if you have 1 million records, then you may have 1 million access teams if it's enabled. Versus for ownership team, you could just create it and right, the citizen developer or the system admin would create the ownership teams. So it's some subtle scalability characters here. So implications of ownership. So again, it's basically needs to check the user and any of the other owner teams with permissions against the type and its owner ID. So basically it would save the team ID or the user ID, right? Uh, More team members, the more check is need. So if it's a team, it would have members, right, in a separate table. So it would do a join and then check. So you may have some performance issues if you have very large number of records with team ownerships. So something to keep in mind. Again, it's a balancing act. So these are just some guidelines over here, but again, it's a balancing act and it's used extensively. So ownership is used like extensively and therefore millions of records, at least for dynamic CE implementations. So I'll move on. So with that, how does the whole fit into together? At most, you would always use a business unit. You would have users, you would have teams, you would have security roles, right? So a business unit defines a security boundary for a users, owning team and security roles. So you could uh, create a business unit and assign a user to a business unit, assign a team to a business unit, and assign a security role. But then that user's life or that team's life would be scoped to that business unit. So that's super important to remember. Then security roles again belongs to one business unit. So again, like I said, if you assign it to a low level business unit, it would be only visible to users of that business unit, right? So you'll have to figure out, usually you keep your security role in the root business unit and your users also in your root business unit, right? And then what determines the access to a record for a user, right? So it's a combination of security role, it's cumulative, the business units is associated with. So depending on where the team or the user is placed, team memberships, right? What users are part of which teams, explicit record sharing. So if they have the record is being shared, so it looks through all these layers and that's what derives the access to a record. So it's pretty intense what it does in the background to get you the record that or the records for a given entity that a user has access to. So with that, we'll just, I know the previous was too much content and it's difficult to illustrate all this in a demo because you would have to log in with multiple users to actually illustrate the point. But I hope it was good information around the concepts, what all is available out of the box with CDS. So when you're again making your decision of whether to use SQL or whether to use SharePoint, or whether to use CDS, you can use some of the talking points from these slides to explain to your customers that these are some of the advantages you get. So as you want to scale, you can easily use one CDS instance for like 5, 10, 15 applications and design your security model accordingly, which is what I'll try to explain in the use cases, right? So, so this is a user access review use case for one of our very large customers. And basically there was the use case is all about, you know, uh, the team manages 21 business units and or corporate functions for the company, right? And it has one compliance entity and it wants to partition and have access only the from the 21 business units. If the business unit is the shared services teams, they should have access to all the records. If the user is in a particular business unit or a corporate function, then that team, the record should be only visible to those teams. So it's pretty much record partition, etc. Isolation was all required, right? For this use case, which was a classic case to implement a business unit structure, right? So what the way they went about doing this is Each CDS instance has a root business unit. So they went and they created another business unit for the application. They called it the user access review business unit. So they created a child business unit. And under the child business unit, they went and they created the 21 business units for their 21 departments that they support, business units and functions that they support, like example, HR, IT, finance. And then they created teams, owning teams of like contributor and read only, depending on where the person is. The person could edit the record or could only view the record. So they created two teams within each of the business units. And then they added users. So they kept the users in the root business unit because they had requirements where a user could be in more than one team or more than one business unit, and more one business unit would have more than one team. So that's how they went about designing it. And the way the compliance entity eventually translated the records was when the record is created, they would assign the team. So if the record is created by a person who belongs to the HR team, then the owner of the record would be HR team. So any person in the HR business unit which is having a contributor access could edit the record or could read the record. So that's how they went, the ownership was set up, and that's how they met their requirements. So it was pretty granular, pretty like a global application, and that's how they went about addressing their security needs, right? And then they set the privileges to business units for one of the security roles and parent-child business units for the shared service security role, so that they can see all the records. And then they use teams and team memberships to work through the whole security model. So the second use case is this is another interesting one where basically you have this sensitive request approval. It's a business process used company wide for this large multinational. It's the same company, both the use cases. And this is mostly to basically track foreign corrupt practices, right? And all the sensitive transaction reporting on that, so on and so forth. And here, the difference was they wanted basically to have a deep hierarchy where they would start off from their org structure that would branch into the app specific structure of business unit. So they had like a 6 level deep hierarchy, right? And then they define fields around it that they would select where it would place. And based on that, the team would get assigned. So it was like a 6 level deep hierarchy, very complex, but they were able to achieve it easily with CDS, right? So here, what they went and did again, they followed the same pattern, right? So the root business unit, they created a business unit for the sensitive request approval application. Within that, they created their various child business units. Within the child business units, like as an example, cloud and AI. Below cloud and AI, they created a business applications group. Business applications group again had a child business unit for Americas region. Americas region had Brazil, and Brazil had human resources. So they went and they created. It's a pretty complex requirement, and you'd be very amazed. So people in Power Apps world would be like, what is this guy talking about? But some of these applications which are mission critical and have a global footprint, the security model gets very complicated very fast. So it's like impossible to do it in SharePoint list. Again, I know both are Microsoft products, but it gets very complex to do it in SharePoint or in SQL Server. With CDS, you get all these benefits. So as you can see, they were able to build this granular structure, and these are all real use cases, right? It's not a PowerPoint slideshow. So they are all real use cases. So they went and they built this 6 level down use case. And then again, they changed the ownership to teams. So they kept the users at the root business unit. And I keep emphasizing this because my next slide, I will explain why I keep emphasizing on creating a child business unit for your applications and the users in the root business unit, right? But in the next slide, I'll talk about it. But here, this is what they did, right? So as you can see, so if you're building a application that is a complex business process flow, which is going to be a combination of model driven and canvas apps, different apps on top of your CDS, to achieve a business requirement, then you may want to consider using CDS, right? So this would be like a deep hierarchical security model that you cannot build with SharePoint, or if you're doing it with SQL, it's going to be super complicated, right? So that's how they went and they built it. Pretty much the the logic and the thought process was the same. In the previous use case, it was just a flat BU structure, one level. There was no parent child. Here, there was like a 6 level deep parent child BU structure. So you can see two different flavors and how they can easily be modeled in CDS. And in some of our cases, you know, people forget is they think of an app and they think of the security model, etc., only related to the app. Whereas when you're deploying that app in production, you may be sharing the same CDS instance with multiple applications, and each application could have its own security model, right? So like I showed the two use cases that I have deployed over here, and this is how some of our large enterprise customers are deploying their applications. They are not creating for one app, one CDS instance. They are predefining, they go and they define an environment strategy. As a part of that, for each in production environment, you have one CDS instance. That's how the environment structure is set up. So, which means you would have 50, 100 applications using the same CDS instance. At that time, you need to have clear guidance around your security model, which is where you would always recommend keeping your users in the root business unit, because a user can belong to only one business unit. So if you put a user in one of the child business units, then another application has to comply to that security role and it may not function. So then it would break. So that's why as a enterprise level patterns and practices standard, you would recommend keeping all the users in the root business unit. For each application, to again isolate it so that it's a nice container, you would create an application specific BU. So as you can see, we have a user access review child business unit. You would have a sensitive request approval business unit, and then you would have for your other applications separate child business units if they need to be there. And then each business unit would have its own container, and you would use teams and team memberships to work through the security model. So both applications which are super complex have their own security requirements, can be modeled independently and then deployed in a central CDS instance, which would be super hard to do with SharePoint or SQL or some traditional data source.